Mr. Case is on his way in from Melbourne. He's going to be a few minutes late. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. First and foremost, welcome to our board work session regarding our feasibility study. I just want to kind of set the timeline, but before I do that, I want to talk about what is the purpose of a feasibility study. The purpose of a feasibility study is to ascertain whether or not there is a need in the organization, whether or not there's capacity within the organization in a conceptual framework to accomplish the charge and the priorities that the board has established. It is not a design, it's not a schematic, it's not a commitment of financial resources to complete or do any of the projects. Again, this is informational. As Crabtree has wound down to the completion of the feasibility study, I've asked them to be present this evening. In the event there are any board questions pertaining to specifics regarding the feasibility study and some of the data that has been analyzed. So there's a lot of work. The next step, if the board chooses to move forward with any of the information, is to engage in design and schematic development. And that would be a contract. Again, that would commit some financial resources, but again, it does not commit the board to building anything. So I just want to be clear up front regarding why we're here this evening. So if you rewind the clock to October of 2018, this is the point in time where the initial project proposal was received by Crabtree and Rohrbach and Associates. On December 11th of 2018, we held the project kickoff and presented that to the Wilson School Board. From December of 2018 to February of 2019 is the point in time where we started our information gathering, building visits, administrative work sessions, looking at all of the different sets of data that we received from our buildings. In March of 2019, we held key stakeholder visioning exercises that were inclusive of community members, students, staff, and administration. Later that month, in March of 2019, we gave the Wilson Board a project update presentation. Throughout the months of June and July of 2019, we conducted a demographic study. We shared those results. We analyzed those results. From August to November of 2019, we started to formulate the beginning of our recommendations and various options. In January 6th to be precise, we presented different recommendations and options to the board. On January 13th, we held another public board work session on January 13th of 2020. Based on advice from the board, on February 10th and February 13th of 2020, we held 2 community forums to gather input from our community. On March 12th, 2020, we held a high school and middle school student focus group. And the significance of March 12th is that's the day that we were told that we needed to close our schools. So administration worked with various committees of the board, notified Crabtree Rohrbach that we were going to put the discussion of this project on hold until the fall of 2020. And here we are in November, in the fall of 2020, 8 months from the time we last discussed this particular topic with our high school and middle school students, to share with you what has been the culmination of a lot of input, a lot of hard work, and a lot of analysis. So as we move forward with the presentation tonight, we are going to be sharing and each taking a part in many of the slides this evening. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask Mrs. Troutman to come up and talk to you about some of the themes that emerged from our conversations with the public.
I'm going to run the slideshow too. I'm okay to run the slideshow. Yeah. Hang on. Where is... Okie doke. Okay. All right, well, as Dr. Fadley mentioned, I want to just take a little bit of time to recap some of the work that we had done in the early part of 2020, where we really spent a good amount of time gathering some input from our community, from our staff, as well as from our students. And we did this at a lot of different ways. We held optional building level meetings at every school. So we went out and we met with teachers who, our staff, who had interest in the feasibility study, and we met with them and we answered any of the questions that they may have had. We conducted 2 town hall meetings with our community. Both were fairly well attended. And then we held middle school and high school focus groups. And as Dr. Fadley mentioned, we were scheduled to do an elementary focus group, and then obviously school was closed. But we did have great sessions with both our middle and high school students. I said, I think it's the last thing that we did before school closed, so interesting. And then finally, we conducted a community-wide thought exchange. So just as a reminder, thought exchange is the tool that we utilize when we're looking to gather just thoughts from our community about a particular topic. So as you know, we had a presentation that we had developed with the recommendations for the feasibility study. So we had shared that out for all of these different stakeholder groups, and we had shared that out with our community, and we asked them through Thought Exchange to react to it, to give us their thoughts. And the way Thought Exchange works is folks can share their thoughts, and then people can come in and they can rate those thoughts. So what it does is it provides you just kind of with a general overview of how the community is responding and reacting to a certain topic. So what we found with Thought Exchange was that the community's top priorities when they reviewed our study were safety and smaller class sizes. And I want to show you, I think this is really interesting. So this is a word cloud. And what it does is it takes into account all of the different topics and things that individuals respond with in their thoughts. So I think it's really interesting. It says smaller class sizes, obviously are very large, and then it says safety and also upper house and lower, right? So really what that tells us is smaller class sizes, safety was about connecting the upper and lower house, right? So I thought that was really interesting when you look at that word cloud and what our community really was thinking when we showed them the proposed feasibility study. And what was really interesting is they also can take into account just how different people are feeling about different topics. And so when they started to talk a little bit about grade realignment, and we're going to talk a little bit about grade realignment just in some of these other focus groups and things. But when you looked at how folks responded about their thoughts about grade realignment, they may have had completely opposite thoughts about grade realignment, but where they were similar in their thoughts were about smaller class sizes and about safety. So I thought that was very interesting, just something interesting from our community. And then we were also able to pull some of our top-rated thoughts, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but of the top 10 top-rated thoughts, this isn't letting me scroll, there we go. You can just read a few of these. It says smaller class sizes, students are the top priority, safety, classroom size, smaller class size lead to success. Class sizes need to be kept small at the elementary level. Safety at the high school should be a top priority. I think class size is extremely important. So again, it just reiterates really what we found in that study. When individuals looked at that full feasibility study, the two areas that they really focused in on were those two. So we found that interesting and thought that was something that we should continue to keep at top of mind as we go forward. Then we wanted to talk a little bit about what we found in our focus groups. So I want to just say to you, when we got to our focus groups, the majority of what people wanted to discuss was grade realignment. And that is not necessarily what we're here to talk about tonight. Certainly, that's something we're going to need to consider down the road in our timeline down the road as we move forward with our feasibility study. But I thought it was important because that was a lot of the discussion, just to share with you some of the common themes that were discussed in those focus groups. So some of the themes we heard in the community was, and again, I want to say, for the most part, I would say our community and maybe our staff was pretty much divided on the concept of grade realignment. But what they did discuss was that they did feel that equity among students was important. We heard multiple times in those groups that they felt that West was perceived as the better school. There was a desire to see students come together earlier. There was a lot of discussion about the need for kids to come together earlier in their careers here at Wilson. There was talk about fear of losing the walkability for students, especially at Southern, that concern that maybe students wouldn't be able to participate as much because they would lose that ability to walk to and from their homes to get to school. And the ability to accommodate extracurriculars with a much larger student population, that came up multiple times. How are we going to handle that with a much larger population? And then there was a little bit of a talk about concern about transportation. How long is a student going to be on the bus? What is the cost of all of that if we went with the grade realignment? Then we talked with the staff, and we did meet at all of the different levels. I will say, obviously, our attendance at the middle school buildings was larger, because obviously that was affecting them a little bit more. But we did have good participation, and again, I feel like there was definitely kind of both sides of people's thoughts on this issue. There was a lot of folks that had, again, see the value in bringing our classes together sooner and creating equity. especially when we talked at the affected grade levels, that 5th, 6th, middle school level. There was a concern about their certification and what and where they would teach. And then again, the same concerns, walkability of the school for the students, and then that concern about losing the community feel of the school if we went with grade realignment. And then our students were really fascinating to me, because our students, for the most part, were very much in favor of grade realignment. They really felt strongly like they did not come together as a class until about sophomore year. Our high school students said that. They said it's very difficult for them to feel like they were really part of a cohesive group of students until about their sophomore year. They felt things like athletics, obviously 9th grade STEM program, having joint events and things helped with that transition. But again, they really overall felt like it was very difficult to transition from the middle school environment to that 9th grade year. They did say, again, West is perceived as the better school, and they definitely have a lot of interest in coming together sooner than 9th grade. But they did also raise that concern again about not being ability to have the accessibility of the school if, in fact, it was, we did go to a grade realignment, that they would lose some of that walkability, ability to walk to school, bike to school. So overall, again, we felt like this was good information that we received. Again, that's not the point of our conversation this evening, but it's something we definitely are going to need to take into consideration as we move forward. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. But my recommendation is that now that we're kind of back together and we're starting to talk again about the feasibility study, it's time for us to go back out again to our community and all of these stakeholder groups, because things have changed. The world has changed. People's thoughts and ideas have maybe changed. So I think there's an opportunity for us to go back out yet again with things like a thought exchange, some sort of town hall meetings, maybe virtually, just to gather some additional information. So that's something we're going to look at as we move forward. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Fred. Yes. Go back. The thoughts? This one? Yeah? So those are the ratings. So those are the different, yes, that's the, how many people rated it and how they rated it, like how many stars they gave it. So that received the highest rating, right? So
that's sample size, it's not significant. You have 30,000 adults. That 30 people is an insignificant number.
well, that's how many people rated that particular thought. High, right. So we didn't have that, we didn't have that high of a response.
That's what
Right.
I'm saying. So it was this the sample and seeing this.
Okay. Well, if you go through, you can see all of the ratings. Obviously, 63 people, lowering class sizes, any option, so you can kind of go through. What we find is that when people go in and they review, the way the tool works is when you go in and somebody provides a thought, then however many people rate it like a 5, that's how it gets the higher ranking. Does that make sense?
No, I'm not worried about
Oh, yeah, okay.
I'm not worried about the ranking. I'm just concerned that 30 people means nothing to me. That's an insignificant problem. You have 30,000 adults.
Yeah, and like I said, there weren't 30,000 people that took the survey. Right. So, okay. Thanks. Any other questions? Nope. All right. Fred, I think you're up.
Sure. You want to come up there? Yes, please.
Yeah.
Good evening, I'm Fred Witham. I am the Director of Educational Planning at Crabtree Rohrbaugh and Associates. So I'm looking at your educational capacities and your enrollments through the process. We updated our enrollment studies based on your actual experience with kids coming back to school with the pandemic. And what we were comparing it to as a baseline was the average between the conservative and moderate projections made by Decision Insight, which is a third-party educational demographer. So those numbers are not our projections. Those projections were provided separately to the district through a contract, and then they were the ones that we used to make comparison. So you ended up, beginning this year, with 272 fewer students than predicted. Of that, the majority, 95% of those students were from grades K to 5. 10% was from 6 to 8, and even given the pandemic, you actually grew in your in your senior high school level by 14 students. The significant piece about the elementary side being 95% is that the majority of the students came from kindergarten and first grade. And based on our workings with other clients around the state, what we are seeing is that at no other grade levels are there as many private available options, including simply keeping your child at home for an additional year before you send them off to kindergarten. So given the fact that you have that many students in kindergarten and first grade, there is a high chance that a high percentage of those students will return into the system next year. We looked at each by grade level, and we talked to Decision Insight and asked them how they were planning on altering their projections based on the pandemic. And they have been following the housing market, both new homes as well as the construction of new units. And they believe that the strength of the housing market and the turnover in housing permits do not warrant an adjustment to their numbers. And given that your actual enrollments are as solid as they are, even though it's 272 less than was projected, it certainly is explainable to the pandemic. We would concur in a review of the numbers to say, I wouldn't change your projections based on that information, that you should still work with that, except with one caveat. I think you should probably be planning for a larger than usual kindergarten class, potentially a larger than usual first grade class. You probably will have a smaller than usual second grade class, and then those groups will present themselves as bubbles high or low through the next 13 years as they will eventually move through the system and out the top. Any questions that I could answer on enrollments?
First of all, Decision Insight, I said this before, doesn't quite understand the values of the number inside that, so I'm not going to go through that process again. The information to you was presented in a format that was not correct. We went out, we did some things that they should have done on their own. We know some projects are moving forward, and I really still have a problem with this, because I do stuff for a living, we used to build walls throughout the United States, and what they've done, how we did this, is totally wrong. We gave them the information. We don't give these folks information. They go out and do the work. One of the slides showed we had a decrease of 200, that's not a surprise. I know there's going to be bubbles, we know that, but once again, I'm going to keep pumping this because until it sinks in. If you don't understand what goes into that, you're not going to understand those numbers. You know two housing projects aren't moving forward. You know there's very little room for growth. The single family homes right now.
Are you nuts? Have you driven around lately?
Amy,
Have
please.
you driven down North Church Road and seen the entire length of the...
So if we could just continue, let's get through the presentation, and then we can have the discussion moving forward.
I'm an expert.
So what we have before you this evening is a two-phased approach to deal with the issues in actual student numbers that we will be seeing moving forward. What we do know by our actual students is that our capacities at our current elementary schools will far exceed what we're able to do in terms of educating students. So part of the phased approach and the plan that we are presenting to move forward, at least with the design and schematic, is the construction of a new elementary school with a max capacity of 700 students. The rendering that you see in front of you is, again, it's just a conceptual design. And if you look at the pictures on the screen, the one at the far left of the screen is the Lincoln Park site. We own all that is currently in the boundary, which is approximately a little over 8 acres of property. So what the conceptual drawing shows you is a 700 student building. It doesn't matter if it's a K4 or a K5 building in terms of the design and schematic functions when we move forward, because it is still an elementary school. So the cost range for a 700 student capacity school is between $26.4 and $26,940,000. So in addition to the elementary school, as part of phase one, we talk about the Wilson High School additions and renovations with a cost range of $33.3 to $33.8, inclusive of those 11 items. So I want to make sure that we talk about, at least go through these 11 items, because these are critical in terms of preparing for the future. So 88,500 square feet of building additions, performing art spaces, high school administration, associated corridors, kitchen remodel, exterior windows, lighting, HVAC replacement in the lower house, which is equivalent to about $4.8 million. This has to be done regardless of whether we move forward with the project, the building projects or not. Those HVAC units are at their end of life. New food service equipment, converting existing guidance areas into learning space, converting existing high school administration to library support, converting existing health suites to learning space, converting the existing auditorium stage and stage to a all-inclusive cafeteria to service the entire school, converting the existing music rooms to family and consumer science, converting the existing administration to music support spaces, and converting the existing kitchen and cafeteria in the lower building to classrooms. Again, the key here is from the themes that developed in our conversations and our gathering information was to address the auditorium, was to address from the standpoint of equity with our athletic facilities, to address the safety issues at the high school by connecting the buildings. So this is a rendering of the high school site plan, and keep in mind again, this isn't an exact. This is demonstrating that this can be done on the current site, making this facility useful for the next 20 or 30 years. Again, another conceptual drawing of what it could potentially look like when it is completely done. The massing concept. This obviously is some conceptual ideas about reorganizing space. Again, when we get into the design of the facility and the schematics, if that's the board's wishes, all of these particular things will become conversation pieces, engaging the staff, engaging the board and administration into exactly where things end up going. The next part of Phase 1 has to do with the athletic field renovations. And we've kind of, we've discussed this quite a bit as a board. We talked about this outside of the feasibility study. We talked about it, bringing it back into the feasibility study. We talked about it at a previous board committee, joint committee meeting, about a potential plan for much reduced scope. That was kind of put in a fashion that it wasn't desirable. So what we've chosen to do in terms of assigning a dollar figure is split the difference and go into the midpoint, which I believe captures the essence of what was communicated at the joint work session. I know that this needs a lot more conversation moving forward, but this particular project would provide one turf softball field, one turf baseball field. It would provide an additional baseball field in grass and 2 softball fields in grass at the high school. Concession and press box, batting cages and bullpens, infield and site lighting. We are still working through some of the contingencies on stormwater. I do want to make mention that the parking lot and restrooms are not included in the Phase 1 budget. That was the higher dollar figure of the athletic field project. So to kind of wrap up what we're calling Phase 1, the new elementary school, the high school additions and renovations, and the athletic field renovations, total $65,275,000 to $66,275,000. Now we get to the point where we're talking about Phase 2 work, and this is at Southern Middle School. So Phase 2 would consist of the existing building size and grade configuration. We do realize that there is a split on grade realignment and keeping the existing structure. What this would require to maintain the existing building size and grade configuration is extensive renovations to make this facility equitable to that of West. So there are some considerations here, and the reason that this project is in Phase 2 is because, as Mrs. Troutman alluded to, we would still like to go out and gather some additional information from our community, from our staff, to make sure that we make the correct decision, whether it's grade realignment or keeping the existing configuration at Southern. But what is apparent is if we go with the keeping the existing 6, 7, 8 structure between both of our middle schools, building our elementary school for a maximum of 700 students, we would still require an additional 16 classrooms between $6 and $8 million to be added to our existing elementary footprint, in addition to our building of a new elementary school.
So does we get attached to Cornwall, or where would?
We would have to have further conversation about that based on the trends and of enrollment. That's kind of why it's,
Because it was lumped in with the southern piece, I didn't know if that.
no, it doesn't have anything to do with it. It was just to be transparent with the board, that if we maintain our existing structure, we do have issues at the elementary level, even though we build a new elementary school. How do I blow this up, Chris? Control? Okay, so now that I can see it, so here's the proposed timeline, and keep in mind that this is just proposed. These things can be slid back and forth, but the thought process is beginning in '21, starting the work at the high school. About midpoint through the high school work, we would, within a couple months of each other, start the new elementary and the athletic fields, which would encompass phase one that that was shared with you. The timeline and the start of Southern is with the elementary school. Our plan would be to complete the elementary school so that we have a place to put either Southern students or Cornwall students, depending on the future direction of the grade alignment or not, so that as the elementary school finishes, we would be able to move the students into that space in the '24 school year in August. The athletic fields, if you notice, would be ready for use in the year 2023, and the high school would be complete and ready in the summer of '23. So again, this is just a proposed timeline, and it can be shifted. The gray area is the design designation. So the boxes underneath the new elementary school, it would be in design for approximately 8 or 9 months, schematic, before the bidding took place. The construction is what you see in the year '23 and beyond. So that's equivalent in each one of the projects. We wanted to make sure you saw the design, the bidding, and the construction phase of the projects for phase one and phase two. So, putting phase one and phase two together, the total estimate is $90 million. So at this point, it's time to talk about the finance piece, which is, okay, go ahead.
There's a lot of information missing there. I asked to see the class sizes projected out. Okay? What are we looking at? 24-foot class size? What are we looking at?
What do we, say the question again?
Okay, what are we looking for the class size? Elementary school?
We haven't had that board direction yet.
Well, no, but then how can you come up with a need for schools if you don't know this class size?
Well, the way I could answer that question, Mr. Martin, is this. Given our current class size, as it exists right now, we do not have space in the future for elementary students. So if we were to lower our class sizes, that is just another piece of information that would solidify that we need additional space, because if you move a class from 24 to 20, you're going to need additional sections across the district where we currently don't have space to put additional sections. Prime example of that is Whitfield Elementary. So if we were to say our class sizes at elementary are going to be 20 and below, which is what they are right now, we do not have space for those children to fit those class size parameters in our schools. So we do have a piece of information. Right now, I'll say it again, let's just say there are 24 students in each grade, which they're not. Some are higher, some are lower. We do not have space in our elementary environment for the future, given that fact. So if we lower class sizes, we're going to need more space than we currently have.
Okay, now, from the projections which everyone agreed with, from Insight, they show the leveling off and growth with River Elementary. So why would we spend all that money when you can do a temporary solution to that?
Well, I think what you'll find, Mike, is that if you look at the data, the actual numbers, our schools will be above 100% capacity by the year 2025, 26, which means we can't afford a temporary solution. We have to have a long-term solution, because those numbers are going to continue to grow over time. Those are facts. Facts based on actual numbers that we currently have. Okay, Christine?
Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to go back to this slide to kind of recapture the previous slides of the average of Phase 1 and Phase 2 of what we had just seen, which is a total of $90 million. This is additional capital costs if the new elementary school would be considered, which were not included in the $90 million. And the funding for that could possibly come out of capital reserve or some other type of financing as we approach that timeline. So for the $90 million, this slide shows different debt run rates. So the white column on the left shows our existing debt. We have $72.7 million of debt, 65 of that is principal. And this is what this looks like after we do all the refunding that we committed to for this year, which actually saved the district $200,000, which was a really nice win for the district when we were in the throes of trying to balance a budget in a COVID environment. So interest rates range between 0.88% and 4.39%, and we would have the debt paid off in 2028. So the next three columns show the $90 million added to our current debt in two phases, $66 million in 2021 and $24 million in 2023. If we keep the same debt service, so when we say run rate, that just means the level of debt service we're paying off every year in our operating budget. So right now, we pay $10.9 million every year against our debt. That includes principal and interest. If we would do the same for the extra $90 million built in, that would extend our debt payoff by 12 years to 2040. And adding the additional principal, we would be adding $47.8 million of interest at rates ranging between 2.19% and 2.62%. The green column represents if we would just slightly bring our debt millage rate down to $10.5 million a year, and that extends it by another year of debt to mature at 2041 with about $4 million of extra interest. The yellow column represents if we would bring the run rate down to $8.5 million a year. And the purpose of doing that would be to free up millage for our operating costs of that building, which we will talk about in future slides. And this just shows the interest rate going up slightly as a percentage, and then obviously a $39.4 million interest rate difference, and a difference of 22 years from when we would pay off the debt if we don't do any projects. So before we go any further with the discussion about phasing in mills to actually pay for the staffing and operating costs of a new elementary school, we just want to talk about some of the assumptions that I have here. One, based on the timeline, the proposed timeline we saw, the new elementary school, if decided to move forward with that, would be completed in the summer of 2024. However, elementary students wouldn't be moving in at that completion date. Rather, Southern or Cornwall Terrace students perhaps would occupy that building for the 24-25 year while the Southern construction goes on. And then the year 2025-26, the new elementary school would be occupied by the elementary students based on the redistricting that would have to take place. In this assumption, there's 4 sections of each grade K to 5 in the opening year. And the average increase in annual operating costs would be approximately 3%. So when we talk about staffing, if we look at a current elementary school in the Wilson School District at this moment, and we move that forward 5 years, it's average of 3% a year. And that's all in. That's staff, that's salaries, that's benefits, the PSERS rate increase, all of it, including operating costs like utilities and so forth. And the other assumption in this model is that our real estate annual assessment growth would be approximately 1%, and that would be net of assessment appeals, which we have been encountering, as you know, on the last couple of years. So looking at the current cost of operating and staffing an elementary school in Wilson School District and projected 5 years from now, it's approximately $7.8 million or 3 mills. So how do you incorporate 3 mills into an operating budget? So mathematically, you can do it over 5 years and increase millage by 0.6 mils every year. It compounds to year 5 at 3 mils for $7.8 million. So in this slide, I don't know if I can point with this. So this row right here shows what the projected Act 1 adjusted index would be for Wilson, potentially. Those projections haven't been published since COVID hit, but those are estimates based on information that I have gathered. Could go up or down. So the portion of this millage increase, if the district board would decide to go to index, would be this 0.6 mils would have to be committed to the new elementary school staffing, which leaves only this line for our existing operating costs of the district. So as you can see, 0.37 mils brings us about $925,000. And in year 2, because the index drops, because it's an average of 3 years, we'd only have $134,000 to have coverage of increases for our operating costs. Now keep in mind, real estate tax, current real estate tax isn't the only revenue that covers our expenses, but it is the largest revenue line. And this just shows the difference of what we'd have left to fund our existing operations. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, how do I get this bar away? Okay, so this is just a visual of the millage build-in over the 5 years. to get to our 3 mills to open the school with complete elementary staffing. This scenario would show a split in how we would get to our 3 mills. So you can see the 3 mills there on the right-hand corner at the $7.8 million, but we have it split between tax millage of 0.42 and the debt run rate coming down to $8.5 million a year, which frees up approximately 0.96 mils. The difference of why it goes from 0.96 to 0.92 in the last 3 years is based on the assumption that our assessment is growing over the 5 years. And then you can see on the bottom of this slide, when you take away the 0.42 mils or the 0.41 mils at the end from your Act 1 index mills, that last line is how much the district would have left to actually cover our existing increased operating costs. This is a visual of how to get to 3 mills using this scenario of the 0.4 mils of tax and the debt run rate reduction. So we want to look at index, Act 1 index for the district. So the yellow line is where the district would have to be if we were at Act 1 index for the next 5 years. And there's some years of history there, but I want to show this slide, which is interesting. When you look at this, the history, at least in the years I have shown here, shows that, and this yellow line is literally the mills that we increased year over year. The green line is the percentage that represents. And if you look back to 07, 08 through 11, 12, the district board voted to exceed the Act 1 index with exceptions that were available to the district at the time. And at that time, there was actually 3 exceptions that were available to the district. It was a debt exception, it was special ed exception, and I just lost my train of thought with that. There was a PSERS exception. So as those exceptions kind of phased out, we only have the special education exception available to the district anymore. But you can see that at the time, I looked back on the audit reports to confirm those numbers, and that is indeed what the board committed to. That was the building of West Middle School. So at the time, even though those weren't the best economic times in our country or locally, there was the commitment to go over index for those years to fund the operating costs of the new middle school. So we haven't talked about building the budget yet. It's right around the corner. This is, the Finance Committee has seen something similar to this. I continue to crunch the numbers. So this is a rendition of what a 5-year projection could possibly look like today without doing a new elementary school staffing phase-in. It could carry the debt of the $90 million at the $10.9 million run rate. So just to look at this particular model shows a 1.4 mil increase. That's above index. That includes the exceptions. The year before, as you can see, the year we're in, we did not increase millage at all. So if we would consider a 1.4 mil increase, which is index plus exceptions, that would kind of be a reset. As we talked about in May, anytime you add millage or don't, it's a compounding effect year over year. So when you're given your Act 1 percent, index percent, it's based on the year before, whatever you did the year before. So it's your millage at that point in time. As you can see, if you look down here, we have a $3.1 million loss budgeted for this year. That was $10 million, if you remember, and we took $7 million of debt refunding to get to $3 million. We had the opportunity to do it, and it turns out that it worked out to our best interest. We actually saved money instead of costing us money to refund our debt. However, that is now passed, and we have to look to this coming year's budget, which is 21-22. So right now, based on assumptions that we have built into the model, we would be showing a $6.1 million deficit for 2021. You can see it gets a little better as we go. This is assuming a 3-year revenue recovery. If you remember, we reduced our revenues by 5.6% in our reaction to COVID. So this is the recovery of our local revenues for that. Some of our real estate tax revenue, even though we had a 0 mill increase, we took a hit with some larger commercial assessment appeals, which also hurt. So we're recovering from that as well. So you can see that we are in a recovered place through these 5 years at our current status quo operating budget. Trying to get that bar away. Okay. So you can see at the beginning of this year, we started with $20 million of fund balance. And you can see how the losses then take away from our fund balance. So basically, what this is trying to show is that, I'm sorry if I jumped ahead here. This is status quo. The bottom line is our capital reserve fund balance, $7.6 million projected at the end of this year. And we had met as an administrative team, and based on capital needs projected throughout the district, we will have depleted that fund by 23-24 if we don't put any excesses that we experience in the general fund into that fund. It's the only way that fund is funded, with general fund excesses. And you can see on the yellow line that our committed PSERS fund balance will be depleted in 2 years. And that's covering us for this recovery period of losses. So we ended up with $12 million in that fund balance at the end of 20. We're projected to use $3.1 million in this year. Ending balance in 2021 would be 8.9, and then we'd use the 6.1 million in 21-22 and the difference in the next year. So this is the status quo model. We're meeting our green line board policy of staying within no lower than 3% of the next year's operating expenses. So this particular model shows we would have a new elementary school, and we would have to incorporate new elementary staffing. And depending on how the enrollment goes, even without a new building itself, we will have to phase in staffing to cover an increased population. So this changes the picture because now we just seen that just to cover our existing operations, we needed to use all that millage. We didn't have millage to go to use. That's the ceiling if you stay at index. This shows that if we drop the run rate, that $2.4 million every year can go towards that phase-in, but we still have to use 4.42 mils of the 1.4 and the 0.66 and the 0.82 to phase in our staffing. And as we go, we would probably be having to hire those staff over year to get to year 5. So this paints a very different picture, and you can see the negative amount in column 23-24 basically has depleted our entire fund balance, which is not sustainable. Again, a lot of assumptions are built into this model. So we're going to talk about that. So budget to actual, how have we done over the last 5 years? So thankfully, our actual revenues has exceeded our budgeted revenues. You can see the percentage differences in this graph. Our actual expenditures versus budget were also favorable for us, as you can see on this graph. And then this was our actual excess of revenues over expenses over the last 5 years. And I wanted to, it's not on the graph, but I wanted to let you know what happened to that money. So in 2015-16, the 2.5 million went to capital reserve. In 2016-17, 1.2 million went to the PSERS committed fund balance, and 2.5 million went to unassigned fund balance. In 2017-18, 2.5 million went to the PSERS committed fund balance, and $1 million went to capital reserve. 2018-19, 0.5 million went to capital reserve, and a little over 2 million went into the PSERS committed fund. And this year, the $1.5 million went into the PSERS committed fund. Keep in mind that the fourth quarter of 1920 was very different than any other fourth quarter in at least this time frame, if not further back. And we still only ended up with $1.5 million. Now, we had projected a loss, so it's much better than we had budgeted for. But had we had a regular fourth quarter, we probably would have hit break even or a loss as budgeted. So this is the difference in seeing what we budgeted as a break even or deficit and what we actually ended up with. So the purpose of this slide and the few before this was to say that budgets are just that. There's a lot of assumptions built in. We hope to always be on the favorable side of the revenues and expenses, because it is the only way to get any money into our capital reserve or our committed fund balance, which we're projecting on using during this COVID period. So it's there for that rainy day, and the rain has come, and we need to use it. And then my closing comments on these slides are two things. For any kind of staffing growth, whether it's in a new elementary school building or not, there has to be a commitment for the board to at least go to Act 1 index based on what we've seen. Now, assumptions can change, and all kinds of factors can change in there, and possibly having to go to exceptions, as we saw in the West years. We have to keep in mind the taxpayer. Not all of our taxpayers are parents currently. We have about 14,000, a little more than $14,000 taxpayers in this district, commercial and residential. So this would be carried by all of our taxpayers. And the other part that we can look at and should look at is that when you're building staffing in, you don't necessarily have to say it's all additional, that there's no way to save, that there's nothing else to look at in our operating efficiencies. So we need to make a commitment to look at that as well, because as much as we want to supply the needs of the educational function of our district, we also need to look at what we could possibly maybe restructure, redesign. We had talked about what does secondary look like post-COVID. Maybe there would be changes in the way we staff our educational buildings. So that concludes my comments. I'm not sure who's next. Okay.
I just saw this, I know that there's some things, a couple of things that I think should be good. We never drop below, since I've been on the board, we never reduce our debt. And our last meeting explained, honestly, we did not want to do that, and really this year, we did not want to dip into that, because that puts a burden on the taxpayers, and pushes out that whole debt for the years. I think you had some of the slide there, but you can see what that does overall to taxpayers. So we haven't had a finance committee recently, but just clear on that, that is not something the finance committee would recommend. This is pushing the debt out, taxpayers spend beyond what it's being. I mean, you gotta look at this, and it seems very diplomatic how she presented this. What she's saying is, there's gotta be cuts. If there's a new school, there's got to be cuts someplace else from this. So, she's very diplomatic, she's very nice in how she presented it. Just look at that head on, so, good job.
The only other thing that I would add to this, again, talk about commitment to tax increases, the commitment to actual index. We have to bear in mind that this will come up once again this year in terms of property tax reform and the ability for districts to ultimately borrow without the ability or need to send something for referendum. That's kind of been some talk with the property tax reform. So whatever has been approved or borrowed prior to any property tax reform, the districts will be allowed to pay down that debt. Should it come to fruition, and I'm certainly, I don't have a crystal ball, none of us do, but should that come to fruition, that changes everything in terms of moving ahead with major construction projects. So I'm just putting it out there. I'm not saying one way or another what should or shouldn't be done, but it is a factor that goes into that.
It's important to understand that when you're looking at this as a whole, there's a lot of moving pieces to this, and once again, really has a crystal ball, but with the situation, if we would do this, taxes would increase on 30% of the population.
And I do want to just bring out one other point here. Let me go back to the slide. So when we say this potential next year, 21-22, millage plus exception, or index plus exceptions would get us to 1.4. That changes every year. This special education exception is a formula. PDE loves formulas. And it looks back at 2 years prior, compares your special ed costs to your special ed funding to come up with net special ed costs. Takes year 2, multiplies it times your Act 1 index percentage, comes up with a number, takes that number against the difference between the 2 years, and that difference is your exception. And you have to apply to PDE for that exception. They examine your calculation. So to project what that would be year over year, if this board would even commit to that, is very difficult because it's based on actual numbers after they happen. And, you can't, we try to budget for what we think is going to be our change in net special ed costs, but it's very hard to just kind of project that out. Last year, if we would have taken exception, it would have been only 0.2 mils, not 0.4. So that's how it can change and fluctuate. So it's hard to hang your hat on that unless you calculate. You have to kind of calculate it as you go.
And that's basically 5 mil per run. Okay, that's basically, you can see that, that's the decided incident. One incident was on the video, that, even on the slide, I think you keep the same data.
So this, I'm sorry, did you have a question?
No, the other slide, don't use 8.5.
No, I don't. So, but even if I would, if we do a 0.6 mil every year for 5 years to get to our 3 mils, you can see the index. There wouldn't be a lot left over. If you tax index plus exception, we could say, well, the exception is what's going to do the phase-in staffing. That could be 0.4 mils, it could be 0.2, it could be 0.1, it could be 0.5. We wouldn't know until we go through, and then the difference would have to be taken out of our current operating expenses.
Just one more thing, I know the board doesn't know, because last year, when we passed the budget, we made it clear that there could be some cuts this year, and the board did approve that plan, so not the plan, approve that budget knowing that we could face cuts this year, so just throwing that out, so you understand, I think.
Yeah, so when we had gone through the budget presentation last year, we knew that the $7 million of refunding was a one-year stopgap to kind of see what would happen with the COVID environment and the local economy. And we did mention that the next year, which is the year that we're going to start budgeting, might have to have significant reductions depending on how our revenues recover.
And one final comment, it's not construction that's killing this budget, it's the labor, it's the salaries for the schools. So the board approved, say, $60 million in renovations. That is not the issue. That board financial plan, that's not the concern. It's the concern moving forward because of expenses in short period of time. I'm done.
Correct, and just to reiterate that even without a new elementary school building, we still might have those staffing needs because of our growing population, even if you tack on to an elementary school or have temporary facilities, we still might have to phase in the extra millage. So, okay, thank you. Uh-huh.
Can you comment on what were the primary contributors to revenues being higher than projected and expenditures being less than projected?
So typically in this particular, if we look at revenues by itself, I don't have notes from all 5 years, but I can talk more to 1920 because it's fresh in my mind than the other years. But typically it was conservatively budgeting some of these local revenues. Typically it's not state revenues. It's mostly we're kind of under state revenues, under budget, because state revenues include the component of a PSER subsidy and a FICA subsidy. So if our salaries and benefits were under budget, then that subsidy is also under. Typically, federal revenues are in these 4 years prior are basically flat. So it's always in the local revenue piece. So it's your interim taxes, your EIT, your business privilege taxes, those line items, transfer taxes, that were possibly under budgeted and came in better. For 1920, you can see the gap closes a little bit. There was one large tax assessment refund that was budgeted for 1920 that drug on and didn't happen, and it actually happened this year. So that's one of the reasons that current real estate taxes was better than budget in 1920. And there were some other line items, business privilege tax and earned income tax was better than budgeted. If we look at expenditures, fourth quarter was an aberration, so I will hang my hat on a lot of it being fourth quarter for 1920. But keep in mind that we budget for a full complement of all of our approved positions. So anytime we have vacancies that aren't filled, that's part of the equation. We also have to budget for insurance plan changes, people going from single to two-party to family. We have to base that on projections of what we've seen in the past. We have to budget for substitutes. We don't quite know how that's going to shake out every year, whether it's day-to-day subs or long-term subs, people going out on medical leaves, those kinds of things. And for every dollar of salary that we might be under budget, the PSERS and FICA component is attached to that. So that's basically what it's made up of. For 1920, we did have, I think, over $500,000 of savings in supplies. Just because of that fourth quarter, we did have significant savings in substitute teachers, travel, all those things that happened in that fourth quarter, conferences, supplies. So that's why 1920 is more fresh in my mind when we looked at those variances. Does that help? Mm-hmm.
Christine, can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
For your projections, is that taking into consideration or including the 10.9 million that we currently pay in
Yes.
debt service, or the 8.5?
So keep in mind that even with this particular model that I have up right now, Steph, that shows an $8.5 million run rate. The $2.4 million difference is going towards the growth in salaries. So it's, the budget line stayed the same, or the millage stayed the same, it's just now moved to a different line for salary phase-in. So in neither model, this model, I also show the 10.9 million of debt, neither model is reducing millage at all. It's just transitioning $2.4 million to the staffing phase-in.
Christine,
Right,
pushing
okay.
out debt.
Correct, it's pushing out debt.
That's the key thing.
Yep, as we saw on the slide.
You're
Yep.
just- You're kicking the can down the road. There's somebody else to take care of it.
Was there another question?
The 1% assessment increase that you're assuming, is that just on new construction, or is that being selectively challenged? It's not a global district reassessment or anything, right?
No, there's no reassessment in that. I know you just want to go back to the slide you're referring to. In the last 4 years or so, we kind of net around 0.6%. However, we are having some growth this year. It was netted against significant assessment appeals, but at this point, I felt comfortable doing the 1% assessment growth in this model.
And then we are still legally bound by capital reserve, that has to be a certain amount, we can't send it.
No, capital reserve can be depleted.
What's the one that,
Oh, it's the unassigned fund balance. So when we look at that green bar that I referred to when we prepare budgets, this one, that is a board policy that doesn't allow us to have our unassigned fund balance go below 3% of the subsequent year's budgeted expenditures. So that is a floor to spare the district from basically depleting all reserves and not being able to function.
and then I guess last question, I know we talked about additions on elementary schools, you sort of mentioned earlier, is that like a maybe if we did additions, would that be a 2% operating cost increase versus 3? Are there any benefits there that we vetted out?
Well, the difference between, Jeff could speak to necessarily the utilities and things like that of additions versus a new building. But when it comes to the staffing, when you have a separate building, there will be staff that you will need there versus tacking on to an existing building. We talked about principals, secretaries, custodians, possibly guidance counselor, all your special teachers, music, art, gym, those things, that if something was added onto a school, not saying that the current staffing could handle all of the increased population, there could be some differences, just because you're not separate in a separate location. Same with the additional buses. Now, if we have an increased population, I would, defer to Randy on possible additional buses as we phase that in for enrollment growth. But there could be some savings. Okay, I'll pass it back over to you, Dr. Fadley.
Chris, do you want to come up and Stacy to talk through the next section? We are going to move into some focused conversation at your table, and we want to make sure that we randomly place you so that there isn't any doubt about how we got to the placement. So Chris has this wonderful technology thing that does this. Stacy's going to walk us through the questions that we would like and kind of the structure of those focus groups. But I want to conclude at least the information piece of tonight's session. You've received an email from me. You received information in the Friday update regarding, what questions that you might have or may have moving forward after hearing stuff this evening. We have all of the analytics, all the backup documentation for every everything that was presented this evening, and we can provide that in the update. But I do want to say this. If there are questions that come out of tonight's presentation or something you need clarified, please email those to me, and we will provide the answers to those questions to the full board. Again, I started the evening saying that, what we're hoping for is some direction about moving to the next step in design and schematic. Not a commitment to build anything at this point. And I think that as we move through our conversations at our tables, maybe some of the board's direction will permeate for us this evening, and we can close with some comments from facilities chairs in terms of and other board members as far as what the direction might be for administration. We've done, and I want to thank the team, all of us that contributed to the work for the last 2 years. I mean, this is a lot of work. And this is a big decision. And to the comments about growth, we're trying to put the district in the best position moving forward to meet the needs that we believe are coming in terms of our students. I think we always have to focus our decisions on, obviously, the financial stability of the district moving forward, but equally as important is what is the education environment going to look like for our students, K-12, moving forward.
Well, okay, you've listened long enough, so we'd really love to hear from you as well. And so Chris is going to help me here with the flippity randomizer, so that way we can just randomly put you in some groups. And then what we'd like for you to do is consider conversation around those 2 questions. So you want to just stop on whatever random.
How about that one?
Okay, sounds fine. Obviously, those folks working with Steph will have to log in through the Google Meet, but we'll help you with that if you need help. So if we could have the 2 questions back. We'll take probably around 20 minutes. We'll see where we are there. If you would, as an active listener, just take your own notes. Keep track of whatever it is that you have as questions or whatever you'd like to make sure is shared. After that 20-minute time frame, we will share out with the larger group and actually take notes so that we have a record of what it is that has been discussed across the members of the board tonight. So there are 2. The presentation had a 2-phase approach, so we'd like you to really kind of vet through what you believe the pros and cons of that phased approach would be. And Chris, you want to take the second one?
Sure, just trying to gauge your willingness as a board to have conversations around committing to an increased tax millage and reviewing the current and future operating costs to achieve the goals presented. Really to focus on some of those pieces from the tail end of Christine's piece. And really just the focus around all those different priorities that we established early on in the presentation. We will be at your tables to help facilitate the conversation. I'll bring the groups back up. Christine, Dr. Fadley, the rest of our team is here. Crabtree and Associates are here as well for specific questions that may lend themselves to any members of our team. We'll help facilitate that conversation as soon as we break into our groups.
So if you do have a specific question at your table, just raise your hand. One of us will come over and we'll see who best to answer that question, and we'll make sure they're at your table to address any specific questions you might have.
We're 2 to 3 to speed it up. Yeah. Yep. So we'll ask Lupe and Steph to go to Brad's table. Steph, I'll come with you. That'll help facilitate the technology. Bob, Mike, and Sean can meet at Sean's table. And then Amy, Jay, and Ed up here at, how about Amy's table? Yep, and I'm going to take Stephanie with me. Actually, I'm going to bring Stephanie up on my Stephanie, I'm going to join from my Chromebook, okay?
Okay, thanks, Chris.
All right. Feasibility.
It doesn't show up on the, didn't, or maybe I didn't invite the board. I thought I did a 2 hour.
It's 6 to 7.
Alright.
I mean, I can invite.
No, that's fine. I get the. Oh, actually, you know what?
What's up?
Okay, for the first question, or for the first, number one, we came up with a question regarding the kind of year that we're having this year, given the virtual environment that we're in. We thought perhaps we could, and I think Christine alluded to this in her presentation, could we save some money, particularly at the secondary level in regards to staffing, given that, we could creatively maneuver something on a virtual format. And then the other was through attrition, could we redistribute the staff at the secondary level and perhaps save some money as well that way? We were pretty much in agreement that we really need the additional elementary school in terms of the numbers of projected enrollment, and we feel very strongly about the additional elementary school. I don't know, did you guys want to add anything, Steph or Brad, that I missed?
I think, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that the only negative that was brought up about the concept of having it in two parts is that as elections come and go, some of us may come and go. So if new members join the board, they may not be on board with the plan, which could deter it, seeing as it's in different parts, that if we approve the first part, maybe the second phase wouldn't be approved. That's really the only snag we could see in the process. I think we agreed that the two-phase approach was important in order to build up the revenue that we really need for the staffing for the elementary school. There really isn't another way to do that, so.
There was also, I know, Steph, you mentioned a question around the realignment of the grades with Southern and the renovations there. for kind of whether we know if that's going to end up happening and how that's going to look. But we're going ahead and doing the renovation. So I think there was just some question around, what we would end up doing as a district then.
Right, and if there were some cost savings, if we would do, depending on the grade alignment, if a 5-6 and 7-8 would be cheaper than just completely renovating Southern to bring it up to the standard of West.
And then for the second part, we were pretty much in agreement, even though, of course, we don't want to see the taxes increase, but we feel that the educational needs of the district should be a priority. And a lot of people move into the district because of our education. So it's important for us to maintain what we're known for. So we're willing to make that sacrifice if needed. I don't know if you guys wanted to add any sentiment to that one. I think that's everything. Okay.
So from our group, looking at question 1 and the phasing, one thing that came up in our discussion was the discussion about wants versus needs. And we kind of viewed, obviously, the athletic side as more the want side versus the need side. And when we talked about the need side, we kind of felt maybe the greatest need was actually at the elementary level. So could there be a possibility of readjusting the timeline to focus on elementary first, and then possibly Southern, and then high school last, and then I guess you're doing them for the athletic fields last, based on look at that priority. Obviously, we realize that if you start with the elementary, you obviously need the associated revenue to staff that and so forth like that. So by moving that forward to the timeline, you really have enough time to actually get the revenue to support that. So that'd be one mitigating factor, but that was kind of our thought process as we looked at that to consider, again, where the real true needs are, maybe starting with that first and going from there. Looking at question 2, shockingly, we didn't all agree on what the level of support would be needed to move forward with that. But there was a consensus that obviously if you vote to move forward with something, you obviously have to vote to move forward with the necessary level of revenue to support it if you are going to go down that path. Clearly, we got to be prepared for the fact that if you're wanting to increase a significant revenue source, there's going to be obviously some possible backlash against that, and obviously all of us have to be prepared that could come with that. So just to be aware of that as we move forward. But anything else you guys want to add that I didn't throw in there? Or?
No, I think you pretty much did it.
Okay, great. Thanks.
We began with question 2 first. We viewed this as if we were unwilling to make the commitment tax-wise moving forward over the next 5 years. The first question is really just an academic exercise that ultimately there are going to be costs. To what extent those costs are, especially whether or not a new elementary school is built and the staffing costs that go along with that, you have to be ready to make that commitment moving forward. And so our group was willing to make that commitment. Now, to what extent those tax increases would look like is certainly dependent upon the scale of the projects and whether or not a new elementary school should be built with those staffing issues. That being said, we looked at this from the standpoint of a pro to the district and the community as doing this as an entire group project. I know amongst us individually, some of us had different priorities on some projects than others. But what has been laid out in this proposal signifies to the district and our community what we envision the district to look like 20 years from now, including from an elementary standpoint and potentially a classroom size standpoint to 2 middle schools that should, upon completion of this project, mirror each other in appearance and opportunities for those students. We also discussed with that coming to fruition what the district might look like with a redistricting and having 2 middle school buildings, if we were to stick with the 6, 7, 8 model, to essentially have the same demographics at Southern as would be over at West. And it's a great opportunity for that to occur, not only with the renovation of the Southern Middle School. And then lastly, with the high school campus, again, understanding that with this project that addresses the last part of our extracurriculars for baseball and softball, that addressing the arts program that has been long overlooked, providing some safety that is certainly addressed in many of the concerns, that this is a footprint for the future of the district that certainly would be an opportunity for potential people moving into the district to recognize what we're going to look like 20 years from now. So we certainly viewed a lot of benefits with the proposal that has been outlined. The next step that we looked at is if we were to send this out for a proposal for designs, how much wiggle room do we have to scale things back? How much can we make some adjustments to the financial impact of millage increase? Certainly, we were not a big proponent of that $8.5 million run rate and pushing out debt as long as that third option was. The term house poor was a concern of ours from the table, that we don't make this kind of financial commitment that ultimately will result in cuts, significant cuts, that Mike mentioned, cuts to staffing and/or ultimately some large-scale programs. So that needs to be balanced out as we would move forward with this design project. So that was, I think, covered most of what we had discussed. Amy, Ed, anything to add?
The only thing that I did is that we talked a little bit about right now, we are the second lowest taxes in Berks County, and it's a very economical and value proposal that we offer our citizens. I mean, if we would bump up a couple of notches and be middle of the pack, that is still a great value based on what we're offering to the school district. And that's a decision, one of the decisions we may have to make. If we're in line with Wyomissing or Muhlenberg, is that still acceptable to the board, assuming that no one else is also rising? So just another ad that we discussed.
Thank you for the last meeting. Dr. Baker, do you want to close us out, please?
I certainly can. So one of the, as I alluded to earlier, what the next steps would be is, because Crabtree has completed the feasibility portion of their study, and the work associated with that. The next step in the process, should the board want administration to put an agenda item on the next board agenda or a future board agenda to engage Crabtree in the design and schematic development and work with Mr. Moravich and Fox Rothschild and Crabtree to come up with a contract for that design and schematic work, so that the board, to Mr. Negrini's and other board members' comments this evening, so that we can get a true picture of, we've seen the conceptual costs, but as you move through design and schematic and eventually into construction documents, you're able to manipulate the budgets based on how you design the building, what amenities you put into the buildings and the construction, and for the lack of a better word, value engineer the projects to the board's liking and the board's wishes. So the next steps would be putting that on the agenda for consideration at an upcoming meeting, and giving us some direction to develop the contract for the board to review. So,
I think from a facility standpoint, we would recommend that that be placed on an agenda in the near future, however long, if it's next week or if it's the first meeting in December. But we need to have some more questions answered from a financial standpoint, but we would like to continue that discussion and dialogue.
so I would consider this to be, we're in the very beginning steps of eventually coming back to the board at some time over the next, I would say, 6 months for the design in a lot of respects for the board to consider, moving forward. Obviously, we'll work with finance and to outline some of the parameters that would go into that. So I guess the point being is there's still a lot of conversation and a lot of decision points that this board has to make. This is not my project. As superintendent, my goal is always to put together information working with my team so that the board has the ability to make informed decisions that put the district in the best position moving forward. And that's what we'll continue to do. So I'll end with this. There are many questions that board members probably still have. I offer myself at any time. My team knows I get up extremely early, so I can meet you for breakfast at 6, 5, can meet you for a late dinner, after work coffee. If you have questions, if you have things that you want clarified, send those questions to me, and we will put the answers together so that you have the information that you need to make your decisions moving forward. I thank you for your time tonight. If you have any additional comments you want to make, any questions for Crabtree, stick around for a while. If not, get out of here. And
Is any of this data going to be shared with us?
yes, we're going to put this, all of this in the Friday update. And some additional information in terms of some analytics and some background information. It'll be comprehensive this week. And then after you have a chance to look at it, like I said, just reach out. We'll do our absolute best to get all the answers that you need. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.